Good evening. Thank you all for joining us for tonight's Concord Museum Forum, Family Tree: A Reckoning, with historian Elizabeth Herbin Tryant, in conversation with Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Jacqueline Jones. I've been looking forward to this program since Jackie first raised it last spring, as she told us about a coffee time conversation where Jackie learned of Betsy's latest research project, which took Betsy on a powerful journey of discovery and reckoning into her own family's history. Most of us dream about getting to sit in on a conversation over coffee between two brilliant historians, and tonight we get to do just that, recreating their coffee shop conversation with a few more images and maybe some prepared questions this time around. Professor Elizabeth Herbin Tryant is Associate Professor of Black Studies and History at Amherst College. Her scholarship explores the long history of white supremacy and African American resistance, combining African American history with the history of capitalism. She is currently working on two book projects, Family Tree: A Reckoning, which we'll hear about tonight, and Spindles and Slavery, Grappling with Ties to the Cotton Kingdom in the Industrial North, a study of how people in Lowell, Massachusetts lived with the realities of slavery before the Civil War. Her research has been supported by the Radcliffe Institute, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. In conversation with her this evening is Jacqueline Jones, Professor Emerita at the University of Texas. Professor Jones is one of the nation's leading social historians. She won the Pulitzer Prize in History last year for her most recent book, No Right to an Honest Living: The Struggles of Boston's Black Workers in the Civil War Era. She is also a Bancroft Prize recipient, a MacArthur Fellow, and has twice been a Pulitzer finalist. I hope you will all enjoy this thought-provoking conversation. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Herbin Tryant and Jacqueline Jones.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah. I wanted to start by thanking Allison Schilling and especially Jackie Jones for inviting me here. And thank you all for coming out. I know it's late, right? Now that it's dark, it feels like midnight. We would all like to be at home in our PJs, I'm sure. So thanks for coming out. So I guess I thought I'd introduce you to the project, and then Jackie had some questions, and then we can open it up for Q&A. So yeah, I'll let you know about this new project I'm working on, and I'll start just with some family photos. This is my father, Robert Herbin, and my grandmother, Laura Herbin, and the reason I became interested in history is because of them. They'd tell me stories all the time, stories about life in the South. My grandmother would share memories of her grandmother's experiences of slavery. So her grandmother would tell her about saving up biscuits that she'd cooked. She was the cook. And she'd save them in her bosom, and when she'd go home, her children would be sort of clapping with delight to get these biscuits. And she had stories about the church that her father helped to start, and this was in the Reconstruction period, when that was really an important institution for Black people in the South, was a church. And then my dad, too, had all kinds of stories. And so just hearing about all this, and they're both wonderful storytellers, I just sort of turned to history, enjoyed studying history in high school and college, went to grad school, and whenever I was in the archives in North Carolina, I'd take a little time to poke around and find whatever kind of family history documents I could get my hands on. So this is the sort of document you could find. This is the marriage record of my grandmother's grandparents, so Blunt Tompkins and Rebecca Allen Tompkins, who were married in 1867. So 2 years after the Civil War ended, they got married. And so yeah, I'd find census records, I'd find marriage records, all kinds of things. This is an example of a census record. I imagine most of you have seen it. There's at least one younger person here, my own daughter, who maybe hasn't looked at a census record. So I'll just note that you have a census worker who will go through neighborhoods, knocking on doors, and will write down the names of the people in a neighborhood. And he's collecting things like people's race, right? You can see most people in this neighborhood have a W for white, and then where it's highlighted, those are some of my ancestors, B for black. And then you get their ages, you get their occupation, and then interesting information like if they cannot read and cannot write, which my ancestors could not in this 1880 census. So I was always sort of collecting materials like this and always trying to learn more. This was a newspaper article with some information about relatives in their community in Greensboro, North Carolina. There are some photos of my grandmother's parents there, Isaac and Molly Tompkins, and the store actually that my grandmother ran. So this was during segregation, the time period when a lot of black stores like this might have ended up in the Green Book, the Negro Motorist Green Book, which would give information to black travelers about institutions where they could stop, right, and be served. This wasn't in the Green Book because it wasn't for travelers. It was just for local blacks in that community, a place where they knew they could be served with dignity. And so it was nice to happen upon it in a newspaper. And so I adhere to stories from my dad about his education. This was the school that he attended, the Goshen Elementary through high school in Greensboro. As you can see, it was all segregated, and this really raised a lot of questions for me about why it was segregated and what the experience of going to a segregated school was like. My dad would mention there was an annex, right? He'd attend class in the annex, and the word was that they were going to build a new school, but they never did, right? So he was just always in that annex where you were either too cold or too hot. And he attended segregated schools all the way through dental school. So here he is in his yearbook for college. He went to North Carolina A&T. And so, again, this really had me interested in history. And with that focus on segregation in particular, I ended up writing my first book about North Carolina in the days of segregation, focusing particularly on residential segregation. But I had this other side of my family too. And I'd hear family stories about my mom's side. So you can see on the bottom left, some of our relatives who my mom describes as dirt farmers. So they were farmers in Connecticut who weren't growing much in particular, but they made a living. And that's my grandfather on the right. He was an engineer who worked at Stanley Tools and a number of other employers in the Southington, Connecticut area. And the stories I'd hear from this side of the family had to do with relatives who'd come over on the Mayflower, relatives from Germany. This is the ship that my grandmother's mother came on from Germany in the 1880s. And so, yeah, these stories of immigration, the pursuit of opportunity, et cetera. And I didn't pursue this side of the family history as much because I guess the stories of a dirt farmer aren't as interesting maybe as what it was like to grapple with freedom in the days after the Civil War. But anyway, one day I was reading a book about the transatlantic slave trade, and I came upon a name that was familiar, was the same last name as my grandfather and my mother before her marriage, which was Sterry. And so I read about Cyprian Sterry, who this source said was the biggest slave trader in Providence. And so I felt pretty panicky hearing that name, because I'd never heard any stories about slave trading and our family. I went to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which is a wonderful website where you can look at the 36,000 voyages that historians have tracked. And sure enough, when you plug in Cyprian Sterry's name, 19 voyages come up. So he was a relative of mine. I'm not descended from him. He's essentially like a great uncle, and was the busiest slave trader in Providence. He employed his nephew, Nathan, as the captain on many of his ships. And so this is the logbook of one of Sterry's ships, the Mary, which is in the Georgetown University archives. And so it's a 46-page document that goes into all the details on the voyage to the coast of Africa. I'll read you a bit from the top. It says, "Journal of a voyage by God's permission from Providence in the state of Rhode Island to, it says something to Gore in Africa, on board the good ship Mary, Captain Nathan Sterry. May God grant success to the ship and crew." An interesting idea, right? Because their idea of success is certainly not, what success would have looked like to the Africans that they were going to the coast to purchase. So the logbook gets into all the details on like how they're trading rum for Africans. There are insurrections on board where some of the crew attack Captain Sterry. There is at least one example of Africans taking off their shackles and trying to fight back. So it's a very juicy read, actually, a dramatic voyage. And I think because of all of what was taking place, the captain ended up ending the voyage a little bit early, so he doesn't get a full complement of Africans and returns to the Americas, because I think he'd had enough of it. He also had a lot of illness on board. But you can see sort of the voyage path of the Mary here. Gore at the top. They sailed all along the coast toward the Gold Coast there, making many stops. I guess when I learned about the transatlantic slave trade before, I didn't realize quite how long it would take, right? All these stops. So the first people loaded into the hold would have spent 5 months, right? While the ship was completing its voyage of trying to purchase captives, because there was so much competition in the slave trade, right? There are so many ships, many of them from Rhode Island, but also from England and other countries, all trying to buy the same captives at the same places. This is a manifest of the ship Mary, and it's a long manifest that lists all kinds of items on board, from onions and shoes to the things that you'd need on a ship in case in case they need to make repairs. But the most important good on board was rum. So you can see here they're carrying 19,674 gallons of rum, which is what they traded for Africans. So Rhode Islanders traded rum, whereas English slave traders traded other items. But Rhode Island was like known for its rum. And this is a manifest showing 98 enslaved people being taken. So they're landing here, and I'm sorry, I can't read it where it's saying that they are. Oh, they're landing in Savannah with 98 captives on board. This is an image just showing you what the triangle trade looked like, right? So Cyprian Sterry's ships would often not go, to the Caribbean, but would go directly to the U.S., going to ports like Savannah. But it was pretty typical to stop in the Caribbean, and that's where they'd trade for sugarcane and molasses, which were the key ingredients to make rum. And then Rhode Islanders would often have these rum distilleries. And so they'd produce the rum that they'd then use to trade for captives off of the coast of Africa. And then this is a newspaper announcement letting people in Savannah know that Nathan Sterry has landed a ship with 49 captives for sale. So you can create huge wealth through this industry, and Cyprian Sterry, became incredibly wealthy. And the reason that I know how wealthy he is, or he was because he went bankrupt. And so you can read his petitions to the General Assembly pleading for bankruptcy relief. And so he's listing all the things he had, all the ships, the properties, et cetera. And he's also listing all of his debts. So you get a sense of what this business looks like, how you're dealing with a ton of credit. And if things start to go awry, you could lose it all. And that's what happened to Cyprian Sterry. So the house that you're seeing, or the mansion that you're seeing on the left, was owned by another so-called merchant in Providence, and this was the type of home that Cyprian Sterry was aspiring to own. And so he's sending out all these voyages, trying to rise up the social ladder in Providence. He's got 4 people enslaved living at his home. He becomes a trustee at Brown University. And is on the board for quite a while, even after he loses his wealth. And by the way, that's an image on the right of Brown University's memorial to slavery, which talks about how Brown was a beneficiary of the slave trade, right? But I guess in doing this research, I realized beneficiary is not a strong enough word because it's like everyone on their board was a slave trader. And the institution relied on these slave traders to pull them out of economic hardship after the American Revolution. This is a list of Cyprian Sterry's voyages to the coast of Africa. You can see on here the numbers. So he takes at least 2,150 Africans from the coast, maybe even more. You can see about 20% of them perish en route, and about 1,700 are sold in the New World. So that's a lot to sit with for me. And another thing that made this particularly weird is that I did a DNA test which showed, on my dad's side that I have ancestry from, all these places that Cyprian Sterry was purchasing people. And so, yeah, it's just an odd history to have. And this is my last slide. I guess I just wanted to take a moment to think about the importance of family history in this particular moment, right? A moment when, our ability to learn about the nation's history is under attack, right? So one of the images here is talking about the so-called Stop Woke Act in Florida, which said that you shouldn't be teaching history to U.S. students that brings up feelings of shame, right? And I guess I was thinking about that. What is it exactly that's causing shame? I think in part it may be people asking, where were our relatives when this was happening? Were we involved? I think part of what causes shame is knowing that there's a personal connection. But then, of course, it's not just the state of Florida, right? So in the Trump administration, too, they're removing artifacts in the national parks, talking about the Smithsonian and what can be held there. And so I just wanted to kind of make a pitch for, in this moment when it's going to be harder, I think, to learn about, troubling aspects of the nation's history in museums, I think to have all of us look at our family histories in a clear-eyed way, right? To be open to learning about not just the joyous aspects of our family histories, but the difficult parts, because this is the story of our nation, and we have to be, I think, open to learning what happened in order to really, I guess, understand the past. So I'll end there. Thank you.
So thank you for that introduction, Betsy, and what a wonderful project this is. And I thought for a few minutes we'd talk about your work as a historian, because you're not a genealogist, you're a historian. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the difference and how you approach this project, given your background, given your training, what you brought to it, and also was there an emotional component to this that you did not have when you wrote your first book, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I'm used to looking at difficult sources. Writing about segregation, you come across, upsetting history too. But it does land differently when it's your own family, when it's your own name that you grew up seeing and calling your grandparents. So yeah, it was harder. But I guess for me, a big difference between the work of a historian and the work of a genealogist is trying to really unpack the historical context. So I didn't want to just find out, individuals' lives, but I really wanted to place them in a particular historical moment and use that history to understand the context. So the book that I'm envisioning looks at race in America through the lens of one family, but the goal is really to understand America, not just the one family.
And could you describe perhaps a couple of eureka moments where, going through the archive, you found some document or recording or other material that really just set you back on your heels that you hadn't expected?
Yeah, sure. Well, you mentioned a recording. So I was looking at, there's this book called Toby, which it's a children's book set in Greensboro, and it is actually set in the same community that my family is from. And so it's an important children's book because it looks at Black children in the South through a lens of dignity rather than sort of the caricatures that were more typical of this time period, like the 1930s. And so a historian had actually done an oral history with a number of people from the community, and I found that there was an oral history that was done with my Aunt Doris. And it was really a delight to hear her voice and to hear her stories again, and to see this relative in an archive, because I'd found other family sources through Ancestry.com or whatever, things like the census, but to find an actual recording of a family member was pretty special. So that was one eureka moment. Also, I think finding the logbook in Georgetown's Special Collections Library, that was also something special because it provided so much detail. And it was weird because I do work in the archives all the time. So, you go in as a scholar, but then the thing you're looking at is, this dark history having to do with your relative. And so I didn't even want the archivist to know my connection to it. I just kind of went in fully as a scholar looking at this material because I wasn't ready to really, place myself in connection to that.
And talk
document.
to this archivist whom you didn't know about this connection.
Yeah.
You mentioned oral history, and you not only dug through the archives. I mean, you've done a fantastic job of locating these sources. What advice would you give people who are doing oral history? Because you mentioned, I think, oral history with your grandmother. Is that right? And you noticed that at different times she would give different versions of maybe the same event. So, I mean, this is a very rich source, but obviously you have to handle it with care. What would you say about oral history?
I think oral histories are wonderful, and I highly recommend that folks do oral histories, right? Just to collect those voices of loved family members. And then verify what they find, because some stories are based in fact, and you can verify them. And then others may be a little bit off, right? But there are often ways to check. And I'm thinking here about Roots, right? The very popular book and then TV show in the 70s where the author, Alex Haley, had, done an oral history with his family members and heard that they had an ancestor from Africa. His name was Kunta Kinte. This is how he said river in his language. And then Haley was able to speak with some linguists, see what part of Africa he would have been from, then go there and talk with some local folks who actually, claimed to know of this man named Kunta Kinte. So anyway, he took an oral history and then he was able to get other information to confirm some parts of it. And that's just like, I guess, the most popular example of someone confirming oral history information. But there are, many other kinds of records you can use to confirm it. But yeah, so I did a couple of oral histories with my grandmother, one of them when she was 100 years old. So as you can imagine, she had, the basic storyline right at that age, but, some of the details got a little mixed up. Still, though, super rich information from it.
So I know that there was a book written by Walter Burgess Smith called The Sterry Family. It was published in 1972, and it does mention that Cyprian Sterry lived in Providence and was a merchant, but there was no mention of his slave trading. And maybe you could reflect for a moment about those erasures in the historical record, how you had to read between the lines, how you had to challenge this whitewashing, in a way, of his own history, and what it tells us about the way history is recorded and what's left out, as well as what's in.
Yeah, so that's one of the themes I'm most interested in the project I'm working on is family memory, who's remembered, who's forgotten, and why. Sometimes it's intentional that people are written out of family memory. Sometimes it's unintentional. But yeah, so with this Sterry book, which is a book that was written by a Sterry, and which other Sterrys helped him to write. So my grandfather helped the genealogist who wrote it. He'd go to cemeteries, get names and dates off of gravestones. And so it was a book that I think was meant for the family and to celebrate the family. So there were some stories. I knew the book was a little skewed in that, I'd heard from my mother about some suicides that just were listed in the book as deaths, right? So certainly things were mopped up and I was aware of that. But with Cyprian Sterry, I think you can see why the family would not embrace that narrative, right, of having a big slave trader in the family. I will say that the genealogist worked with a set of sources that may not have mentioned that Cyprian Sterry was a slave trader. Things like his bankruptcy petition says that he had mercantile failures, other things like this. But it's certainly possible to find out that he was a slave trader. So my sense is that Northerners, like, once a certain time period hit, it became unpopular to be associated with slavery, right? So if you're a Northerner, you want to be on the side of the abolitionists, not on the side of the slave traders. And I think that's a part of what was going on, was, like many Northerners, wanting to edit out the parts of the history that don't align with who you think of yourself as being today, right?
Well, that's a good segue into my next question, and that is, perhaps you could tell us more about all the different ways that Northerners were implicated in slavery, white Northerners. You've talked about Cyprian Sterry. He owned these ships. Nathan, his nephew, was a captain. Those are some obvious examples of Northerners implicated in slavery, promoting it. But what were some of the other ways? And your work on Lowell, obviously, is significant here.
So, yeah, you mentioned Lowell. Lowell is a town that was built to manufacture cotton cloth, right, with the cotton being sourced from the South, grown by enslaved workers. But there's so many items that Northerners produced that were sold to keep plantations up and running. So, I mean, it didn't make sense really for planters to grow all the things that they needed because they were dealing with such a lucrative crop, right? So why grow onions, right, when you can be growing cotton or sugarcane or something? And so Northerners produced, the horses, the cattle, the wood, the codfish, right? Salted cod would be used to feed enslaved workers. Like if you go down to Puerto Rico, you'll see all the dishes there involve cod, right? You'd think, why cod? Because it's not native to that part of the Caribbean, but because of this history of Northerners selling codfish down in the Caribbean. But every other item, right? Everything else you could need was produced by Northerners and then shipped down to the southern states or to the Caribbean to keep plantations up and running. So that's another big one, right? And another thing that kind of gets edited out. But yeah, if you're interested in the North and its ties to slavery, I think a great place to go locally is the Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford. So it's right near Tufts University. It's the home owned by the royal family of Harvard Law School. They endowed a professorship, and their family shield was on the Harvard Law School shield for a while. Harvard Law School recently removed it. But anyway, so the royal family had plantations in Antigua, but also kept enslaved people up here in Medford. And it's not like your typical house tour, right? In that as they're showing you the beautiful wallpaper and ceramics and things, they're pointing out that the source of this wealth came from slavery and that, enslaved people slept on pallets, on this floor. And so it does a really nice job of showing you, how deeply slavery was impacting, this part of the country.
One of the fascinating things about your study of these ships, the voyages, is the theme of risk. So the investors, the owners of the ships, the captains of the ships, they were all taking tremendous risks. Why don't you just enumerate for a moment all the things that could go wrong for these slave trading ships, for instance?
Sure. So I mentioned a couple with the Voyage of the Mary, right? So insurrection, also death and disease, right? Once people would hit the coast of Africa, there'd be all kinds of diseases, some of them related to the weather, right? It would be pouring rain and you'd get all kinds of diseases, and the crew would start getting sick once they'd hit the coast of Africa. Of course, once the Middle Passage would begin, and even before actually the Middle Passage, many of the Africans would start dying, but especially during the Middle Passage. And so, that's economic risk, right, for the investors and for the crew to start losing their captives. And I don't know how long you spent looking at that list I gave you of Cyprian Sterry's voyages, but one of them had a death rate, the mortality rate was like 60%, right? So that wasn't typical, but it did happen. And when it happened, that was a financial loss. So other risks, so the one thing that ended up taking Cyprian Sterry out of the slave trade was actually that abolitionists sued him. So Rhode Island and a number of the other states started passing laws trying to put limits on the slave trade. And nobody was really enforcing them, and so abolitionists started suing to try to, to put teeth in these laws. And so one of Cyprian Sterry's voyages was the source of a lawsuit, which again it created another kind of risk, right? Like that he knew he could be gone after by the abolitionists, yet he still decided to send the ship out. But the risk there was that he could lose, $2,000 on top of, I think it was $200 per captive on board. And so a huge financial hit, and he promised the abolitionists that he would withdraw from the slave trade in return for their withdrawing the case against him. And so he did indeed pull out of the slave trade, but then he couldn't pay all of his debts, right? He'd purchased all these ships and all these properties and, was building things and could no longer, cover his debts without these, huge amounts of money coming in. And so that's how he ended up going bankrupt.
One of the details you mentioned, too, is the rum. At times, the crew would get into the cargo, right, and drink. I mean, the Middle Passage, horrific conditions on board ship, the discipline, very harsh, people dying, revolts, and it seems the crew was at times self-medicating even because, and there would go some of the cargo that was supposed to be sold.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was a terrible line of work to be in, right? I think it was people who had no other options who'd work on these ships. And once they started dealing with, death and disease and having to clean out the hold and force people to eat who may have been suicidal, right? It started to wear on people's souls. And they turned to the rum that was supposed to be sold. Yeah,
this in addition to kind of the regular routine of shipwrecks, storms that might take down whole ships and the crew with them. So yeah, it was really interesting to see how precarious this trade was. I mean, obviously it produced great wealth, but it was also at considerable risk to all these traders and captains involved.
Yeah. One thing I noticed is that the more established merchants, someone like John Brown, right, associated with Brown University, didn't make it a big part of his investment portfolio, right? He'd have the occasional slave trading voyage because he saw all the risks and didn't want to lose what he had. But someone like Cyprian Sterry, who didn't come from a wealthy family and was trying to be upwardly mobile and wanted to keep up with the Joneses, gambled it all, and he ended up losing.
Speaking of John Brown, he said at one point that since the slave trade was lawful, it must be okay. I mean, it really takes a great deal of rationalization, justification to be involved in this kind of business. And he seems to be saying, well, if it's not illegal, then I might as well go for it. But I'm wondering if you think it takes a special temperament to be involved in human trafficking this way. Cyprian Sterry wasn't on board these ships. I guess he did not see that kind of suffering. His nephew did.
One interesting thing is that both of them were in the American Revolution. And I think that sort of military discipline, the training in hierarchy and maintaining discipline, the comfort with violence, right? I think that was a part of it. But yeah, it certainly is a particular kind of person who doesn't see, that pain, that kind of pain and horror, and doesn't feel that that's wrong, right? Is able to rationalize it by saying that because it's legal, and it wasn't entirely legal, right? I mean, there were all these laws that were starting to get passed, putting limits on it, saying, you can't trade slaves in foreign countries, right? You can no longer bring captives to the Caribbean. You're allowed to still trade in Savannah and Charleston, but no longer in Cuba, right? There are all these different ways of limiting it. And so, certainly there were people arguing that slavery was wrong and that the slave trade was wrong. So there were voices that the Sterrys chose to ignore, right? And that John Brown's brother, Moses Brown, was an ardent abolitionist, right? Who was constantly arguing back and forth with his brother, trying to make the case that the slave trade was morally abhorrent, right? And so it's not that they didn't hear those voices, because those voices were within their own families.
So we've talked a lot about your maternal side of your family. I do, before we open it up to questions, come back to your father's side of the family. And I found one particular quote of yours, so intriguing. You talked about your grandmother, Laura Tompkins, and how active she was in the Sunday school and the church choir. And you said in pursuing these activities, she seemed as driven as a partner in a corporate law firm, which gave a sense of her will, her dedication, her energy. And I thought that was so interesting. Maybe you could talk about, how these barriers on upward mobility in the Jim Crow South had people channel these energies and these talents in different directions.
So, I mean, she was ambitious too, right? Cyprian Sterry wasn't the only one who was ambitious, but she had a lot of limits on where her ambitions could take her. And she also had a moral compass. But yeah, so being a Black woman in the South in this time period, right? She was born in 1908 and died in 2014. She couldn't pursue, she didn't get any further than, I think, an 11th grade education, although she wanted one very much. And so the church ended up being the sphere where she could sort of exercise her talents. So she would raise money, and then she would announce to the congregation how much she'd earned, which always embarrassed my father. But I think she took pride in her skill in fundraising for the church and leading the Sunday school and all the other things she did for them. So yeah, my relatives on my dad's side were eager to buy land. They'd sort of eke out an acre here, an acre there. They were very much following the politics of respectability, in the sense that, my grandmother would really police her children. She'd drive them to the local jail every year to say, you have to stay on the straight and narrow or you may end up here. But, didn't allow, even though she was, growing tobacco on her own land, she wouldn't allow them to smoke tobacco or chew tobacco. So she really had a sense of, how to sort of get them to succeed, and she was determined to have them follow that particular pathway. So she said that her daughters would become school teachers because that was kind of the career that was, open to Black women in those days, and that my dad would also be a professional.
And he became a dentist. Yeah. So I do think we should hear from the audience if there are any questions, or if you would like Betsy to pursue something. Yes.
Thank you for being here. Given the politics of the moment, I wonder if at Amherst, interest in your academic department is waxing or waning, and to what degree the students who enroll in your department as majors are actually themselves diverse.
I mean, right now, there is a lot of interest still at Amherst in this material, and the students are quite diverse. I mean, you may have heard that after the affirmative action ruling, our numbers did take a hit, so that was disappointing. But there is still, there are still a lot of students interested in this material and coming to our classes, which is a wonderful thing.
Can you say more about the program itself and what kinds of courses the students take in that department?
Sure. So I'm in both Black Studies and History, and we teach courses. Right now, I'm teaching a research methods in Black history, research methods in Black Studies course. And we teach students about archival research, ethnographic research. They're starting to work on their own research projects. I'm also teaching a first-year seminar in family history, and I mean, the students are super diverse in that course. I have a student from Hawaii, I have a student from China, students who are African descended, and have interesting mixes. One student's half Korean, half African. So they are quite diverse. They're really excited to study their own families' histories. They're sort of aware of the possibility of digging up inconvenient ancestors, and they still want to pursue this. But we teach all kinds of courses at Amherst in Black history.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, Claire.
Hi, Betsy.
Hi, Claire. Good to see you.
I'm just curious about, and feel free to sort of sidestep this or answer it in a really sort of academic, broad way, if that's easier. I'm just wondering how, as you've kind of uncovered this family history, I think for a lot of us, right, the people with ancestors who have that Ellis Island story of kind of immigration, like that is the sort of family history that, is easier to talk about and think about. How have they kind of grappled with that longer family history of a different kind of ship? Has that been, I don't know, complicated?
So are you asking about my students or just Americans generally with that sort of immigration story?
Well, it's all within your mom's side of the family, right? That almost that immigration, Ellis Island, 1880s, came over on a ship, for the American dream. Story is very much that sort of we are all immigrants kind of narrative, even as that is also under attack right now. But I guess my question is, how has sort of looking back at a longer genealogy within that side of the family, how has that landed?
Well, I guess it hasn't landed yet in that I haven't discussed it with most members of the family. My mother actually has been quite supportive and went with me to the archives and looked at a number of these manifests, and not being a trained historian, she was sort of doing it wrong, having the documents hanging off, and so the archivist was scolding her. But my mother has been super supportive, although we haven't sort of mentioned it more broadly in the family, where I do think it would not land well, actually. But my plan is to share it with the family members. But yeah, I mean, we have certain stories that we, tell about ourselves, and you come upon something that doesn't align with that, and there's certainly discomfort. And I guess I anticipate that, there will be some discomfort in the family.
Yes. Oh, yes. Betsy's mother.
Can you describe how the logbook of Mary was discovered in someone's attic?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So it's interesting, like the logbook of the Mary ended up on the radar of historians, and it's in a book of documents having to do with the transatlantic slave trade that was published decades ago. But that was just a replica of it. But the original was in the attic of someone who was the neighbor of a Georgetown University student. And so this student was telling his neighbor about how Georgetown had just been reckoning with its history and found all of these, enslaved people who had been sold by the Jesuits who were running Georgetown back in the day. And so he was telling this story to a neighbor who happened to have this logbook in his attic. And so he thought, well, maybe Georgetown can do something with this. I'll donate it to them, and the students can learn more about this history. And so he actually carved isn't the right word, but he built a box for the document that the student then carried on an airplane across the country to bring it to Georgetown. So he was living in California, but the logbook, and we don't have all the details on the path of the logbook, but it somehow ended up back in Providence, right? And then, Nathan Sterry ended up dying. He went down with a ship a couple years later, and his son died, and that was his only child, so it seems not to have gone with him. Cyprian Sterry, all of his documents got burned in the Great Fire of 1801. So I don't know what happened, but someone in the family had it. So it stayed in the Sterry Bridges family and moved with them to Indiana and wherever else, and then to California. So it's a great story of the logbook itself.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. Yeah.
So you've described a great family history, which must be very difficult to deal with. My own personal, I'm the Ellis Island. We're not racist because we arrived in the 1880s. But the bigger economic, like America is America because it is based on that foundation. And so you must be trying to weave the personal with the bigger story. And how do you, in this era where you can't feel bad about yourself, like, and my families were never involved that I know of personally, but like how do you, in this era, how do you say, no, your family was not directly involved, but they came from Germany or they came from Ireland because there was economic opportunity here because the people up north were selling onions to the south. I mean, how do you, that's a tough.
Yeah, I think maybe what you're pushing me to say is that, white immigrants coming to the U.S. entered a system in which they were advantaged, right, in not being viewed as black, right, and so certain jobs were open to them, and there was like a system in place that, and certainly like the Irish weren't allowed to have all the jobs, right, and so there were limits on it, and Jackie can certainly speak to this, being a labor historian who's worked on all of this, but I think the story here, right, is that they kind of entered a country that, had certain opportunities available to white workers. And so even if someone came in who wasn't, an enslaver themselves, they still benefited from some of the structures in place in this country. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I would just say that what's striking is enslaved people who might have learned a trade while in bondage, once freed, could find, first of all, they didn't own their own tools or equipment. White people would not patronize them, and their sons and grandsons became unskilled or manual laborers. And what is interesting is that when skilled workers from the South migrated north, they could not, and this is the 19th century, they couldn't continue their jobs as blacksmiths or as coopers or as masons or as bricklayers because white workers would not allow them to enter their own workplace. These were all white workplaces. Employers deferred to their white workers. And so to say, an immigrant was not racist, still, if that immigrant was a skilled bricklayer, he would probably have more opportunities because a whole group of bricklayers were really shut out of the labor force. So that's, I think, a larger picture here.
And just a plug for Jackie's latest book, right? No Right to an Honest Living. So it's a brilliant book because so many of us had assumed that Boston offered freedom to black people because it allowed them rights, right? But you can't eat rights. And they were kept out of all kinds of jobs. So many of black Bostonians before the Civil War and after the Civil War, right, they're working as day laborers trying to piece together work. And they're looking for the abolitionists to stand up for them and say, not only do black people need an end to slavery, but they also need to be hired, but they're not getting it, right? And so it's a sad story, right, of people who have rights on paper but can't turn those rights into jobs and an income to feed their families with.
And even white abolitionists who were very courageous in the face of violence, harassment, really professed much more sympathy for enslaved people in the South than for their neighbors in Boston. And I think one of the reasons is some of the leading white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison feared that pressing employers to hire more black people would erode financial support for the abolitionist cause in Boston.
So turns out the slaves in Concord who were freed after the Revolution basically were allowed to starve to death over several generations because the good people of Concord wouldn't support them unless they went to church. and, many of them did. So the question I have is, why did Providence become the center of the slave trade in the North and not, Boston or New Bedford or some of the other cities?
Yeah.
Because, Roger Williams did outlaw slavery in Rhode Island originally.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason is that if you look at Rhode Island, there's nothing but the sea, right? So the sea is where opportunity lies. And, you can't, there's not a lot of land for farming or other industries. So it becomes a huge shipping center. And sure, there are other ports, going north from Providence, right, that had slave trading out of Salem and Boston, et cetera. But I think there are a lot of other industries too going on in those places where for Providence, and it's not just Providence, it's Newport, it's Bristol. Like there's a ton of slave trading going on out of Rhode Island, and I think that they found a way to make money, bringing in the ingredients for rum, it's like that's what they specialized in, right, is distilling rum and then selling it on the coast of Africa. And, that easy access to the sea just created great opportunity for Rhode Islanders.
One more question?
I just want to say that for genealogy, I went to a genealogy conference, but all the presenters were historians. So without the work of the historians, we can't build the stories of our families, and that you married that in your seminar is just great news. We love history, and then we put our families in it, and it's become so much richer. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a great way to end, I think.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you.
Oh, sure, yeah, I'd be happy. Oh, thank you.